Russian soldiers have been bailing on Russia's efforts to take over the Ukraine. But what happens when a Russian soldier goes AWOL? Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been nothing short of a disaster. By failing to take the capital Kyiv back in March, his miscalculation became obvious. And as the war moved east and Western weapons reinforced Ukraine's firepower, Russian casualties soared to more than 500 a day. Despite Putin's scorched-earth tactics and mobilization of more than 300,000 Russian conscripts, Ukraine has continued to retake huge chunks of its territory and doesn't look to be stopping soon. Because of this, morale among Russian troops is exceedingly low, according to one recent report from the Institute for the Study of War. At the same time, desertions have skyrocketed since the invasion began in February, with thousands of young Russian men fleeing into countries like Georgia and Turkey, or turning themselves over to Ukrainian troops. But what happens to these deserters? And could this spell disaster for Putin? Russia has a long history of military deserters, in part because of the brutal and inhumane treatment its conscripted soldiers are subjected to. Anytime a military is faced with wartime hardships, poor combat performance, and uncaring leadership, desertion becomes an attractive option. During the disastrous Russo-Japanese War, Russian soldiers aboard the battleship Potemkin famously mutinied in June 1905, inspiring a film of the same name. And after the terrible conditions of the First World War, desertions from the Imperial Russian Army were massive, helping bring about the Russian Civil War and Revolution. Historian Louis Siegelbaum writes that the first few weeks of the revolution witnessed the desertion of between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers, most of whom were peasants anxious to return to their villages. Desertion by badly treated troops has since been a repeating pattern in Russian and Soviet history. Soldiers are conscripted from poor areas, given little training or equipment, and sent to the front lines to try and overwhelm an enemy with sheer numbers. Desertions have often followed, as conscripts are faced with death in battle or from terrible weather conditions. During the First Chechen conflict of 1994 to 1996, Russian soldiers were sent to the front lines in appalling conditions. An article from 1999 found that in military hospitals, young conscripts told stories of being towed into battle after their armored personnel carriers had broken down, of being left by their officers to fend for themselves, or of living off the land. If this sounds familiar, it's probably because Putin's invasion of Ukraine fits into this long pattern. As early as March, reports surfaced of Russian troops fleeing or trying to avoid being sent into battle against Ukraine. Some sabotaged their own equipment and shot down a friendly fighter jet, refused to fight and carry out orders, and even reportedly ran one of their own commanders over with a tank. When Putin announced a mobilization of military reservists in September, the panic spread to Russian civilians. Lines of cars at the border with neighboring Georgia stretched for miles, with Georgian officials saying that more than 10,000 Russians a day were making the crossing. Deserters who avoided being drafted in the first place by fleeing the country are the lucky ones, but their experiences still range from uncomfortable to nearly fatal. Some who attempted to flee were first involved in protests but became discouraged or feared for their lives, like Yevgeny, a 28-year-old photographer from Moscow, now living in Georgia. After the invasion began, he attended several anti-war demonstrations but was demoralized, saying that people were too scared. There were fully armed and very experienced policemen who knew well how to stop the protesters. Such protest rallies dissolve because people are frightened, and it's not something that gives you hope. Yevgeny tried to carry on with his normal life afterwards, but the threat of conscription pushed him to leave Russia. Alexander, another man interviewed from the marginalized region of Tatarstan, sold everything he owned to pay for the journey to Georgia. He told CBC that it's not possible to stay and fight against our regime. If you have anything negative to say, they will simply arrest you and put you in jail. Desertion charges can result in more than 10 years of prison time, which in Russia also means routine abuse, inhumane treatment, and over 15 hours a day of hard labor. Faced with these possibilities, many have done anything necessary to escape, including risking a situation at the border some call hellish. One young man named Ivan described police checkpoints allegedly set up without any approval from higher authorities cluttered the road, manned by officers looking for bribes. But even after paying 2 bribes, he remained stuck in the line, tormented by hunger and fatigue, finally convincing an Armenian couple to drive him across just before it was closed. To avoid recruitment officers at the border, another young Russian named Volodya carried his suitcase 10 miles to another crossing through the mountains on a rainy night and was able to cross on foot. Those with more means have fled to cities like Istanbul, where plane tickets have soared in price and neighborhoods have filled with Russian cafes. In many of the places deserters have fled, there is also tension with locals. Some Georgians have claimed that the Russian exiles hold colonial attitudes, or that there were those who have fled while still supporting Putin. As one woman in Tbilisi put it, "We see people coming into Georgia who are against the Russian government. The problem is that it's not only these people coming. There are Russian people who support Putin and his regime, but they don't want to sacrifice themselves. But because of the horror awaiting them on the battlefield, even many who call themselves Russian patriots have avoided joining the invasion." What happens to those who do? For Russians who are sent to war, desertion becomes much more dangerous. While Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged Russians to surrender and said they will be treated in a civilized manner, much of the danger comes from their own country. Russian conscripts have said that they felt duped or threatened into fighting. In one video, Ukrainian soldiers interrogate a Russian officer and ask what message he wants to send to those back at home. Frankly speaking, they tricked us. Everything we were told was a fake. I would tell my guys to leave Ukrainian territory. We've got families and children. I think 90% of us would agree to go home. But despite feelings like this, attempts at battlefield desertion often mean death, especially for conscripts. Recent reports from the UK Defence Ministry found that Russia has started using so-called barrier troops or blocking units. These are troops stationed behind the new conscripts, whose job it is to shoot any who turn and flee, making attack the only option. According to the report, Russian generals have ordered their officers to hold positions to the death. Ukrainian intelligence recently released an intercepted phone call between one soldier and his wife, where he tells her, "That's how we have it set up. We sit on the second line, guarding the first. Behind us, there's another line. If you go that way, you also won't make it. So it's impossible to run away. They shoot their own." Officers face the same threats. One reporter on Telegram found that Russian Colonel General Alexander Lapin had personally pulled out a pistol and held it to the head of a commander overseeing drafted troops who'd retreated in Luhansk, threatening to shoot if the unit did not return to the front line. Many of those who have tried to flee are conscripted prisoners, who are usually put on the front lines as cannon fodder. Many are given false hope of a pardon if they enlist, despite leaked private statements by Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group militia and the man in charge of the prisoner scheme, that for the inmates, it's not a reprieve, but a death sentence. In October, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that the Russian inmates who are sent to fight often leave their units and try to return to Russian territory after they are given weapons. At the end of December, the dead bodies of over 20 Russian soldiers, most of whom were previous convicts, were discovered in Donetsk. Some of the deserting soldiers have escaped, however, like 27-year-old Nikita Chibrin from Siberia, who was given manual labor duties after he criticized the war to a superior. He managed to flee in a vehicle for food supplies and eventually made his way to Spain, where he is now seeking asylum. What about the people who are left behind in Russia by deserters? Many of the thousands of men who have fled the country or died trying have been forced to leave their wives and families to avoid conscription. One woman interviewed, a copywriter named Daria, helped her husband flee to Kazakhstan when the mobilization was announced. To keep her job, she remained in the country, saying that, "I don't even want to think about the fact that I'm here and he's there. It's very hard and sad." But she, like many, was glad her husband could escape, since in Russia, here there is a feeling that everything is going up in flames. As the war continues into the new year, more and more Russian troops may desert or face the prospect of freezing to death. And as they do, it will put an even larger strain on Putin's resources. While it might not mean an end to the war anytime soon, the long-term implications of so many desertions could be staggering. Russia is already experiencing a brain drain as increasing numbers of highly skilled individuals leave for other countries. Large amounts of desertions also likely mean that Russia will not be able to gain much territory and could even lose the parts of eastern Ukraine still under Putin's control. Mass desertions have toppled Russian governments in the past, and it remains possible that enough of them could force even a leader as ruthless as Putin to end this war. Whatever happens, the status of Russian deserters will likely remain contentious. Even so, those who see no other option will continue to flee, believing that, as one man put it, inaction now would mean probable death later. But what do you think? Will Russian soldiers continue to abandon Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and could it potentially be fatal to the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.